Hi everyone, welcome back to Extra Credit, and today is our 15th episode on ancient Rome. So after the break we took last time, today we return to the main storyline in the days of the Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian himself only ruled Rome for 10 years and was followed by his two sons Titus and Domitian, who were the only other two members of his dynasty or ruling family. And as far as emperors go, Domitian's reign in particular was a pretty low point for Rome because he ended up getting assassinated by the Senate because of his tendencies to be a cruel, tyrannical dictator. As we already saw in a previous episode, Domitian enjoyed torturing and persecuting Christians, but he also enjoyed torturing and persecuting houseflies. In fact, one of his favorite hobbies was to lock himself in his study for hours on end, tormenting helpless insects. On one of these occasions, one of his servants was asked if anybody else was in there with the emperor, to which the servant responded dryly, "Nope, not even a fly." It's funny because all the flies are dead because he killed them. It's not actually that funny. So to kick off today's episode, we're going to read one of the most famous quotes written about ancient Rome by one of the most famous historians of ancient Rome of all time. This comes from the British historian Edward Gibbon, who once famously said, "If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus." I know that's kind of a mouthful, but remember, this was before Twitter and people went on forever about stuff. But to put that quote in grade 8 language, what Gibbon is saying is that the time period we're going to look at today, from 96 AD to 180 AD, is considered by many historians to be the golden age of ancient Rome. This is mostly because the 5 emperors who ruled during this time were considered to be 5 of the best emperors in all of Roman history. In fact, these 5 emperors were so good that historians have come up with an amazingly creative name for them: the 5 Good Emperors. Wow, just hitting it out of the park. This apparent golden age was a time of peace and prosperity around the empire, during which the Romans also achieved some of their greatest ever feats in architecture and engineering. So let's get into this with the first of our 5 all-star emperors. After getting rid of Domitian, the Senate nominated a man named Nerva to become emperor, even though he was already about 66 years old. Now, it might seem odd to choose somebody so old to become the next emperor, but the thing is that Nerva had had a lifetime of public service up to this point, serving 4 of the previous emperors, all the way from Nero up to Domitian. So by the time he got the job, he had seen the good, bad, and ugly of Roman politics, and he knew the kinds of things to do and what not to do. Mainly, don't be like Nero or Domitian. Unfortunately, Nerva himself only lived for about 15 months after becoming emperor, and so his most famous act that he's by far the best known for is nominating a young Spanish general named Trajan to become Rome's next commander-in-chief. Trajan's time as emperor was truly a high watermark in Roman history. It was during the days of Trajan that he made war against the Dacians, who lived in modern-day Eastern Europe, and ended up adding this territory to the empire, which brought the Roman Empire to the greatest size it would ever achieve in the year 117 AD. Trajan then very humbly set up a massive pillar in the middle of downtown Rome to show everybody how awesome this was, in case anybody needed reminding. On that note, Trajan also used his time as emperor to build a brand new public forum in the middle of the city, which was larger than every other forum built by every other previous emperor combined. Think Mall of America, except without the underwhelming roller coaster. After Trajan's death, power passed to one of his relatives named Hadrian, who was the first Roman emperor ever to grow a beard because he was a massive Philhellene. And Philhellene is not like an insult, it's a word that means a lover of anything to do with ancient Greece, and the Greeks had beards. Or maybe Hadrian was just too lazy to shave and it sounded like a good excuse. But whatever the reason for the facial hair, when it came to managing the empire, Hadrian took a very different approach from Trajan. Namely, instead of expanding Rome's borders, he wanted to protect them. You see, Hadrian identified a problem that would go on to become Rome's Achilles heel in the next couple of centuries, and that is that the empire was simply getting too big to control and defend properly. And I can totally relate to this from all my years of playing Risk with my middle school friends, because you can never control Asia for more than like 2 turns because it's vulnerable from like 83 different directions. But if you just stick with Australia, you only get 2 reinforcements every round, so it's really hard to know. What were we talking about again? Right, as I was saying, the Empire was just getting too big to control effectively, so Hadrian took a leaf out of Pink Floyd's book and started to put some bricks in some walls, namely massive border walls that he built around large stretches of the Roman frontiers in Europe. These walls were designed to keep the so-called barbarians, i.e. anybody who was not Roman, firmly where they belonged, on the outside. The most famous of these walls by far is the one that he built in northern Britain, which stretches across the entire country and covers a huge distance of 118 kilometers from side to side, and also included a massive series of military camps. And once again, in an astonishing burst of creativity, historians have chosen to name this massive wall built by Hadrian, Hadrian's Wall. Okay, now you're just trying to tick us off. But Hadrian brought his building skills even closer to home when he directed his architects to design the most remarkable temple ever created in downtown Rome. A beautiful building called the Pantheon, which was a monument to all of the gods and goddesses of the Roman Empire. What makes the Pantheon so impressive is that its concrete dome spans a massive 43 meters and is completely unsupported by pillars of any kind. And this wasn't just impressive back then. To this day, it's still the largest unsupported concrete dome on Earth. Unfortunately for Hadrian, his reign didn't end very smoothly, as it was marked by sickness and family drama, and so he was in pretty rough shape when he handed off power to his successor in 138 AD, a guy named Antoninus Pius. And yes, it's Antoninus with the extra N in there, not Antonius like you all want me to say, and yes, it's extremely annoying. Antoninus reigned for about 23 years, during which time there were no major wars, famines, disasters, plagues, earthquakes, invasions, or anything else, interesting. So we'll just skip right along to his much more famous and much less annoyingly named nephew, and the last of our 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius, aka Original Dumbledore. Marcus Aurelius ruled from 161 to 180 AD, and during that time he made a name for himself as one of the wisest and most intelligent men ever to rule Rome. This was in part due to the fact that he practiced an ancient Greek way of life called Stoicism, which was a philosophy that, among other things, involved taking a chill and laid-back approach to hardship and difficulty. In other words, the opposite of Denethor. Marcus Aurelius actually wrote a huge book of philosophy called the Meditations, which you can still find in bookstores today, and which will still serve as an excellent cure for insomnia. Unfortunately, despite being full of good advice for others, it seems that Marcus Aurelius could have used a little advice himself, namely parenting advice. This is because after Marcus Aurelius' death in 180 AD, his own son Commodus would go on to become one of the vilest and most notorious emperors in all of Roman history, thus bringing Rome's golden age to a very ugly end. Now, to do a bit of reflecting here, it's worth asking whether this so-called golden age really was so golden for everybody after all. After all, as we've seen elsewhere on this channel, and as many historians have pointed out, daily life for the average person in the ancient world really wouldn't have changed at all just because the guy on the throne in the palace happened to be decent or diabolical. At the same time, though, we've also seen that wicked and cruel emperors like Nero really could cause chaos and disruption in people's lives by initiating civil wars, conflicts, and rebellions. And so the fact that these 5 emperors were actually pretty decent guys really would have made a difference, and a positive one at that, in the life of the average Roman. But even though the empire was riding high on the good times, as the old saying goes, what goes up must come down. Or in this case, what goes up must spend the next 3 centuries in a long, slow, agonizing death spiral, punctuated by some moments of glory and brilliance, but mostly ending in disaster. It doesn't really have quite the same ring, I guess. Hey everybody, thanks again for watching Extra Credit. It's always a blast making these episodes, and we are well on our way through our series now with only 5 more left to go. Your challenge for this week is to look into some of the accomplishments of the 5 good emperors, and maybe memorize 1 or 2 of Marcus Aurelius' sayings from the famous Meditations. As always, stay safe, have fun, read a book, and we'll see you next time.